In the sprawling suburbs of Orange County, California, a region often associated with sunny beaches and idyllic neighborhoods, a dark and violent chapter unfolded between late 2011 and early 2012. A series of calculated murders targeted the most vulnerable members of society, homeless men, leaving a community paralyzed by fear and searching for answers. Behind the murders was an unlikely suspect, Itzcoatl Ocamp, a decorated U.S. Marine whose promising life unraveled into a deadly obsession. This story is one of profound contradictions. Itzcoatl Ocamp, once seen as an emblem of hope and duty, became a name synonymous with terror. His transition from soldier to serial killer raises critical questions about the intersections of trauma, mental illness, societal failure, and personal choice. Itzcoatl Ocamp was born on March 20, 1988, in Mexico. His family sought a better life in the United States, eventually settling in Anaheim, California. Growing up, Ocamp seemed to embody the promise of the American dream. His parents worked tirelessly to provide for their children, and Ocamp was raised in an environment that emphasized perseverance and ambition. At school, Ocamp was a quiet yet intelligent student. Teachers and peers described him as reserved but kind-hearted, someone who avoided conflict and harbored a deep sense of loyalty to his family. His parents, particularly his father, instilled in him a strong work ethic and a desire to contribute positively to society. However, beneath this seemingly ordinary upbringing lay a more complex reality. The pressures of assimilation, combined with financial struggles, created an undercurrent of stress within the family. Ocamp idolized his father, but their relationship became strained over time, particularly as he transitioned into adulthood. Upon graduating from high school, Ocamp felt the pull of something greater than himself. Like many young men seeking direction, he turned to the military. In 2006, at the age of 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. For Ocamp, the decision was multifaceted. It offered a sense of purpose, a means to honor his adopted country, and a pathway to a stable future. Ocamp's time in the Marines, however, was anything but stable. He was deployed to Iraq during one of the deadliest phases of the war. There, he was exposed to the brutal realities of combat. Witnessing death and destruction on a daily basis left him deeply scarred. Friends and fellow soldiers were killed, and the chaos of urban warfare became his new normal. Ocamp returned home physically unscathed but mentally fractured. Like many veterans, he struggled to adjust to civilian life. The structured discipline of military service had been replaced by the uncertainty of everyday existence. He experienced recurring nightmares, bouts of paranoia, and a growing sense of alienation. These were classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), but Ocamp, like many others, received little to no support in addressing them. By the time Ocamp was honorably discharged from the Marines, his life had begun to unravel. The man who had once dreamed of building a bright future was now adrift, consumed by anger and resentment. His drinking escalated, and his relationships with family and friends deteriorated. He withdrew into himself, spending long hours alone and exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. One of the most troubling aspects of Ocamp's descent was his growing fixation on the homeless population in Orange County. He began to express contempt for those he saw as societal burdens, believing that their presence symbolized the decay of the community he once sought to protect. This twisted worldview marked the beginning of his transformation from a disillusioned veteran to a remorseless killer. Ocamp's first known murder occurred on December 20, 2011. His victim, James McGillivray, was a 53-year-old homeless man who often slept near a shopping center in Placentia, California. McGillivray was stabbed repeatedly in what authorities described as a frenzied yet calculated attack. His body was discovered the next morning, sending shockwaves through the community. Less than a week later, on December 27th, Ocamp struck again. This time, his victim was Lloyd Middaugh, a 42-year-old homeless man whose body was found near a river in Anaheim. Middaugh had been stabbed multiple times, and the brutality of the attack mirrored that of McGillivray's murder. Police were now facing the grim reality that a serial killer might be targeting the homeless. The third murder occurred just 2 days later, on December 29th. Paulus Dutch Smate, a 57-year-old homeless man, was attacked in the parking lot of a library. Once again, the victim was stabbed multiple times. The rapid succession of these killings left law enforcement scrambling to identify the perpetrator, while homeless advocacy groups urged the public to remain vigilant. As the body count rose, investigators began piecing together a profile of the killer. The choice of victims, older homeless men, seemed deliberate, and the method of killing suggested a level of expertise. The precision of the knife attacks indicated that the killer might have some form of combat training, leading authorities to suspect a connection to the military. Ocampo's motives, as later revealed, were rooted in a warped sense of morality. He believed he was on a mission to clean up society by eliminating those he deemed undesirable. This delusional justification, combined with his deteriorating mental state, made him both dangerous and unpredictable. Ocampo's fourth victim was John Barry, a 64-year-old homeless man who was attacked on January 13, 2012. Unlike the previous murders, Barry's killing marked a turning point in the investigation. Witnesses saw Ocampo in the act and quickly alerted police. He was apprehended near the scene, bringing an end to his reign of terror. The arrest stunned the community. Ocampo, a clean-cut and seemingly unassuming 23-year-old, did not fit the image of a serial killer. The revelation that he was a former Marine added another layer of complexity to the case, raising questions about the role of his military service in his descent into violence. Following his arrest, Ocampo confessed to the murders, offering chilling insights into his mindset. He described his actions as a necessary mission and showed little remorse for his victims. His statements revealed a profound disconnect from reality, shaped by paranoia, delusion, and untreated mental illness. Psychologists and criminologists who examined the case noted the interplay of multiple factors in Ocampo's transformation. His experiences in Iraq, combined with his struggles to reintegrate into civilian life, created a perfect storm of trauma and anger. His obsession with the homeless was not merely a result of personal prejudice, but a manifestation of deeper psychological issues. The evidence against Ocampo was overwhelming. Surveillance footage placed him at the scenes of several murders, and DNA evidence linked him to the victims. Police also uncovered journals in which Ocampo meticulously documented his plans and motivations. These writings provided a disturbing window into his thought process, revealing the depth of his fixation on purging society. As the case moved toward trial, Ocampo's defense team planned to argue that he suffered from severe PTSD, which impaired his judgment and fueled his violent behavior. Mental health experts offered varying opinions, with some describing Ocampo as deeply delusional and others suggesting that his actions were the result of calculated malice. On November 28, 2013, before the trial could begin, Ocampo was found dead in his jail cell. He had ingested a lethal dose of cleaning chemicals, an apparent suicide that ended his life and left many questions unanswered. His death sparked outrage and controversy, with critics questioning how such a high-profile inmate could have accessed the means to take his own life. For the families of the victims, Ocampo's suicide denied them the opportunity to see justice fully served. While his death marked the end of the legal proceedings, it also left lingering frustrations and a sense of incompleteness. The murders committed by Itzcoatl Ocampo had a lasting impact on Orange County. Vigils were held for the victims, and community leaders called for greater protections for the homeless. Advocacy groups used the tragedy to highlight the vulnerabilities of those living on the streets, pushing for systemic changes to address homelessness and its associated risks. Ocampo's case also reignited national debates about mental health care for veterans. His story became a grim example of the consequences of neglecting the psychological needs of those returning from combat. Advocates urged policymakers to invest in comprehensive mental health services, emphasizing the need for early intervention and support. The story of Itzcoatl Ocampo defies easy categorization. He was a man shaped by his circumstances, a product of war, trauma, and societal failure. His descent into violence is a cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated mental illness and the fragile boundaries between heroism and horror. At its core, the case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition. It challenges us to examine the systems that fail the vulnerable, from homeless individuals to veterans struggling to reintegrate into society. The case of Itzcoatl Ocamp continues to resonate as a chilling example of how systemic failures can contribute to tragedy. Beyond the personal horrors of his actions, the murders exposed broader societal issues: the neglect of homeless populations, inadequate mental health support for veterans, and the challenges of addressing untreated psychological trauma. Homelessness, often dismissed as a peripheral issue, took center stage in the aftermath of Ocampo's spree. Advocacy groups called for increased funding for shelters and outreach programs, pointing out the vulnerabilities faced by those living on the streets. The victims of Ocampo's crimes were not just statistics, they were individuals with stories, struggles, and humanity. Vigils held in their memory emphasized the importance of seeing and supporting the homeless population rather than ignoring them. At the same time, Ocampo's story sparked urgent conversations about the treatment of veterans. PTSD, a condition experienced by nearly 1 in 5 veterans returning from combat zones, became a focal point of debate. Mental health professionals highlighted the lack of resources available for returning soldiers, particularly those struggling to find their footing in civilian life. Post-traumatic stress disorder is often described as an invisible wound, one that scars the psyche as profoundly as physical injuries mark the body. For Ocampo, his experiences in Iraq were a crucible of fear, death, and survival. Exposure to the brutal realities of war created a psychological burden that went unaddressed upon his return. Research shows that early intervention is critical in treating PTSD, yet many veterans face significant barriers to accessing care. These include stigma surrounding mental health issues, long wait times at Veterans Affairs facilities, and a lack of understanding about available resources. Ocampo's inability to seek or receive help underscores the urgent need for systemic reform. In the years following his case, some progress has been made. Increased funding for veterans' mental health services and the expansion of programs like teletherapy aim to provide more accessible care. However, advocates stress that these efforts are just the beginning. Ocampo's victims James McGillivray, Lloyd Middaugh, Paulus Smith, and John Barry were emblematic of a population often ignored and misunderstood. Homelessness in Orange County, like in many parts of the United States, remains a persistent challenge. Factors such as rising housing costs, unemployment, and mental illness contribute to the growing number of people living on the streets. In the wake of the murders, local governments and non-profit organizations redoubled their efforts to address homelessness. Initiatives such as Housing First programs, which prioritize providing stable housing before addressing other issues like addiction or employment, gained traction. Community members were encouraged to support shelters and donate to programs rather than perpetuating harmful stereotypes about the homeless. Yet, despite these efforts, challenges remain. Homeless individuals are disproportionately victims of violence, often targeted because of their perceived vulnerability. Ocampo's crimes highlighted this grim reality, serving as a wake-up call for both policymakers and the public. The case of Itzcoatl Ocampo serves as a stark reminder of the need for compassion, vigilance, and systemic change. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members, whether they are homeless individuals or veterans struggling with invisible wounds. To prevent future tragedies, communities must work together to address the root causes of violence and despair. This includes investing in mental health services, creating pathways for reintegration for veterans, and ensuring that no one is left behind. By learning from the past, we can strive to build a future that is safer, more inclusive, and more just.